The Subcommittee on Intergovernmental Affairs and the Committee on the Interior, Energy, and Environment will come to order. Without objection, the Chair is authorized to declare a recess at any time. Good morning. Today, the Committee on the Interior, Energy, and the Environment and the Subcommittee on Intergovernmental Affairs will examine permitting and environmental review process for infrastructure projects. This is the third permitting hearing this committee has held this Congress. Previously, we have heard from many witnesses about the ways in which convoluted requirements and lengthy application periods for federal environmental permits negatively affect infrastructure projects. Today, we will continue to explore this important topic and discuss how delaying infrastructure projects hurts the economy and communities in need of modern, improved infrastructure. Environmental protection statutes like the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, and the National Environmental Protection Act were passed with noble intentions years ago, and no one disputes the need for a healthy environment. In recent years, however, federal agencies have taken it upon themselves to broaden their interpretations of these statutes and made too many rules and regulations that stretch the bounds of the authority that Congress has provided. As a result, permitting workloads and associated delays have increased. For example, the EPA lowered the national ambient air quality standards for ozone in 2015. Under the new lower standard, 209 counties in 22 states are designated as non-attainment areas, subjecting all projects in those counties that could produce emissions to more rigorous permitting requirements. Similarly, the Obama administration's EPA, along with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, finalized the Waters of the United States rule, which vastly expanded their jurisdiction to issue permits under the Clean Water Act. These federal power grabs have increased the number of project applicants, lengthened wait times, and caused the cost of projects to balloon. Under President Trump, the administration has prioritized infrastructure modernization and federal permitting reform. The President's management agenda and the one federal decision policy implemented by executive order direct federal agencies with permitting responsibilities to reduce permit application processing times by instituting a number of best practices. Some of our witnesses today will discuss how these proposals can move the ball forward to address well-known problems with the federal permitting and environmental review status quo. We'll also hear from the Government Accountability Office. GAO has done extensive research into federal agencies' management of their permitting responsibilities, and in the process has observed both common problems and best practices. One major issue GAO has identified across federal agencies is the lack of quality data on permitting milestones. Many agencies with permitting responsibilities are simply not tracking when applications are submitted or approved. While the administration's proposals are a step in the right direction, their success relies heavily upon the ability to hold agencies accountable. GAO's work suggests the data necessary to do so may not be readily available. To that end, my subcommittee has initiated conversations with GAO about creating a permitting scorecard that can be used as a tool to measure agencies' progress as they begin to implement these necessary reforms. The scorecard would determine a letter grade, A through F, for each agency based on their adoption of agreed-to permitting best practices. Last month, I sent a letter to GAO requesting a review of efforts to streamline the federal permitting process, including an assessment of key permitting-related indicators for monitoring agency progress. As we discuss permitting reforms and recommendations today, I hope the conversation will contribute to developing a scorecard that can be used now and in the future to promote best practices and incentivize agencies to improve their permitting processes. Today's hearing will provide an opportunity to discuss how we can ensure a future where federal permitting functions are more efficiently achieved and better serves the American people. I look forward to our hearing our witnesses' recommendations. And I now recognize the ranking member of Interior, Energy, and Environment Subcommittee, Ms. Plaskett, for her opening statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank our witnesses for being here and my colleagues for coming to this important hearing. Mr. Chairman, thank you for calling today's hearing concerning the federal permitting process and how it relates to infrastructure development. The idea that environmental protection, not just of the natural environment, but also the human environment, goes hand in hand with infrastructure development, is now an old one. It goes back nearly 50 years to the passage of the National Environmental Protection Act, commonly known as NEPA, and the call that the environmental review and permitting process become more efficient and streamlined is nearly as old. The Virgin Islands sees both sides of this coin. With tourism and travel accounting for nearly 30% of the island's GDP right now, we are highly aware of the need for environmental protection. But because of our higher cost of living, anything that potentially slows our economy, including unnecessary delays to infrastructure and responsible development, must be addressed. Delays to some projects are ongoing, and that is an impediment to our economic health. Excuse me. The need to fast-track projects in the Virgin Islands is especially urgent as the economy recovers from the 2017 hurricane season. Today marks 1 year that Hurricane Irma hit the islands of St. John and St. Thomas. My office has provided assistance with numerous projects that have been delayed in the permitting process. In some instances, these delays go back as far as 12 years or more. That's outrageous. Mr. Chairman, I would like to have included in the record a letter I recently wrote to Rear Admiral Tim Gallaudet, Assistant Secretary of Commerce for Oceans and Atmosphere, and Mr. Chris Oliver, Assistant Administrator for Fisheries, for assistance with the federal permitting of an energy infrastructure on St. Croix. The permit application to install a single point...
Without objection.
Thank you. The permit application to install a single-point mooring buoy system to allow the Lime Tree Bay Terminal facility to receive shipments from very large bulk fuel carriers has now been pending for a year. This is just one example of the list of projects that I have been asked to assist with the permitting application. Applicants incur extraordinary costs as a result of the delays in the process, and developers are thwarted and sometimes discouraged from bringing projects out because of this. In 2017, President Trump issued 2 executive orders with the aim of streamlining the environmental review and permitting process. But it turns out that these executive orders are mostly redundant or superfluous to bipartisan laws already on the books. Since 2012, Congress has passed 3 major laws designed to streamline NEPA. Each one refined some permitting requirements and provided the federal government with new tools to speed up environmental reviews. The FAST Act, in particular, created the Federal Permitting Improvement Steering Council, which answers to the President, comprising members from 13 agencies. It is designed to coordinate and expedite the permitting process. But President Trump has yet to appoint a permanent executive director of the council, and a fee structure to collect money from project sponsors so that the council can facilitate faster reviews has yet to be established. So we have all the tools we need to expedite the permitting process if we fully fund them. But this is where President Trump's proposed budget for fiscal year 2019 fell short. It called for a staggering 1/3 cut excuse me, in the budget of the Environmental Protection Agency and a 16% cut from the Department of the Interior. It's hard to see how we can speed up the permitting process when the President is calling for drastic cuts to the agencies that oversee much of that process. We know what the answers are. We just need to fund them. I thank the witnesses for their appearance today and look forward to their testimony.
Thank you. I now recognize the ranking member of the Intergovernmental Affairs Committee, Mr. Raskin, for his opening comments.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much, and thanks for calling this hearing on how we can develop our infrastructure without sacrificing the environment and the rules that protect it. Welcome to our witnesses today. I want to start, Mr. Chairman, by introducing a very thoughtful letter that we received from Earth Justice to the committee, if that's
without objection.
Great. Thanks so much. Mr. Chairman, NEPA was signed into law nearly a half-century ago, when experience showed the dangers of not examining the environmental implications of development before building took place. And those dangers involved the creation of perilous environmental harms, and also dealing with environmental problems that came up through the litigation process, which was obviously divisive and polarizing and took years to get through. And so NEPA was established so that the environmental questions could be considered first before the building process took place. Leap before you look was the old way of doing things, and this was look before you leap, so we wouldn't destroy neighborhoods and environments unnecessarily before projects took place. So the rules arising out of NEPA and other environmental statutes like the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act were designed to enable planners to build environmental planning into the development process. Now, President Trump, who of course is in the real estate development business and declared himself the #1 champion of the eminent domain process, which has trampled so many Americans' property rights and environmental quality of life, has been in a full-blown offensive against the permitting process under NEPA. And the suggestion, of course, from the very beginning of this administration has been, as Steve Bannon put it, to dismantle the regulatory state. And obviously the permitting process is an important part of the regulatory process that has grown up under our environmental laws. As I noted in July, the Office of Management and Budget every year issues a congressionally mandated report that identifies the costs of government rules on the private sector and then the estimated financial benefits of the rules for the American public. The most recent report found that federal rules imposed just under $5 billion in costs on business, but resulted in more than $27 billion in benefits to the American public. That's a benefit to cost ratio of more than 5 to 1. So instead of permitting rules being some kind of staggering burden on the American people, they actually help everyone across the board. Now, blaming environmental permitting rules is a way to flatten out and demolish the regulatory process to benefit specific corporations and developers. The BP oil spill is a good example of why environmental enforcement and permits are so essential. In the wake of the oil spill, which created 11 human deaths and the deaths of 1 million seabirds and contamination of an entire ecosystem, the Bureau of Safety and Environmental Enforcement was established to oversee offshore oil drilling, but President Trump's proposed 2019 budget called for slashing by 43% environmental enforcement by this Bureau. And this is obviously the wrong way to go. Permitting is not the problem. It should be seen as part of the solution. Studies have shown that project funding, developing a local community census, and dealing with residents and businesses in the path of a proposed development are far greater sources of delay than the permitting process. So let's focus on what the real problems might be. Everybody is for simplifying government and reducing red tape when we can do it, but certainly not at the expense of maintaining the environmental safeguards that the American people have established. I thank all of the witnesses in advance for sharing their insights today. I look forward to continuing this important discussion. Mr. Chairman, I yield back to you.
Okay, thank you. I now recognize the Chairman of the Intergovernmental Affairs Subcommittee, Mr. Palmer, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank the witnesses for being here. I think it goes without saying that infrastructure is a critical issue that directly affects the quality of our life in our communities, and I think we can have good infrastructure without compromising environmental quality. The issue is, have we gone overboard to the degree that we now have infrastructure that basically gets a D grade? We've got a deteriorating infrastructure that's having a significant impact on the economy. We've got congestion on the highways that cost us $160 million a year in lost time and wasted fuel, which, by the way, when you have that kind of congestion, increases some of the air quality issues that we're all trying to deal with. We've got power outages that have an additional impact of $150 million a year. All these costs, by the way, get passed on to the consumer in one form or another. In 2017, the American Society of Civil Engineers analyzed the state of the nation's infrastructure and estimated that American families lose upwards to $3,400 each year because of it. And they further scored our country's infrastructure, as I said before, and gave it a grade of D. Fixing failing infrastructure should be a top priority. It's certainly a top priority with me, and not only just fixing the failing infrastructure, but improving the quality of what we have and expanding it as our economy grows, and it's growing as the Atlanta Fed announced just last week that they expect GDP to be 4.6% for this quarter, which is a huge improvement over the economic conditions of the country over the last few years. We're going to need higher quality, better infrastructure. The lengthy permitting process, the multi-agency approvals, and the tens of thousands of pages of environmental impact assessments are causing all kinds of delays, and they have been for decades. The cost to rebuild infrastructure will dramatically increase due to inflation and prolonged construction costs. As an having worked for 2 engineering construction companies, I know the time and money it takes to get a project off the ground, and I've used this example in a couple other hearings of what happened down in Texas, where you had a state road, a U.S. highway, and an infrastructure. The state road was delayed 33.5 months. It added over $5 million to the cost of the project. The state road was delayed 5 years. It added almost $18 million to the cost of the project. And the interstate, it's a mile and a half, adding an interchange, was delayed for 11 months, and it cost about $447,000 a month in delay costs. That added almost $4 million to the project, which all of that is infrastructure money. Contractors and project developers are forced to comply with dozens of permitting requirements spread across multiple agencies that are subject to reviews and often duplicative and redundant, and then they wait. They wait for responses and approvals from federal agencies. Waiting costs money. Delays cost money. We see it when, as I just gave those examples from Texas, when a project started and then they have to delay. These contractors are forced, you have to pay the contractors for their people being on site and their equipment on site, and then if you shut it down, a 5-year delay, they got to move off site and then restage. People are hired and they're ready to work, and they expect to get paid regardless of whether or not the federal government is meeting the deadlines. As I said, moving equipment around, compliance, administrative tasks, updating contracts, they've grown out of date, delays. These are all delays that cost money, and it adds up over years. These delay costs eat away the resources that could be put to other critical projects. And my home state of Alabama has experienced infrastructure project delays firsthand. We've been trying to get the Northern Belt Line, I-459, built, and the funding for that was first approved in 1989. We've built 2 miles of road. The project would create a 6-lane beltway around the city of Birmingham. We're the largest city in the country without a complete belt line. So 30 years later, 2 miles of road. Federal Highway Administration recently predicted that construction of the remaining 50 miles will take another 35 years. I'll be 100 years old. And, Mr. Chairman, I promise, if they take that long, I'm going to drive on it. So we're literally throwing our infrastructure dollars down the drain with these delays. The current administration is working to modernize the nation's infrastructure and cure the permitting inefficiencies. In August of last year, the President issued Executive Order 13807 to streamline the environmental review and permitting process. The Executive Order established a one federal decision when it comes to major infrastructure projects. This gives a single agency the authority to navigate the project through the permit authorization process as well as the federal environmental review. The President also encouraged cooperation between the executive branch and Congress to shorten the time-consuming environmental review process to 2 years. I look forward to hearing from today's witnesses about the federal permitting process, including how it contributes to a backlog of needed improvements and how reform proposals can address these problems. I thank the witnesses for being here, and I yield back.
Okay, thank you. And I'm pleased to introduce our witnesses at this time. Mr. Frank Rusko, Director of Natural Resources and Environmental Issues at the U.S. Government Accountability Office. Thank you for being here. Mr. Philip K. Howard, Founder and Chair of Common Good. Ms. Christy Gullfuss, Senior Vice President of Energy and Environmental Policy at the Center for American Progress. And last but not least, Mr. Darren Baxt, Senior Research Fellow at the Heritage Foundation. Welcome to all of you. Thank you for being here. Pursuant to committee rules, all witnesses will be sworn in before they testify. Please stand and raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear or affirm the testimony you are about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? So help you God. Please be seated. The record will reflect the witnesses have answered in the affirmative. In order to allow time for discussion, I would ask the witnesses to please limit your testimony to 5 minutes. Your entire written statement will be made part of the record. As a reminder, the clock in front of you shows your remaining time. The light will turn yellow when you have 30 seconds left and red when your time is up. Please also remember to press the button to turn your microphone on before speaking. And at this time, I'd recognize Mr. Rusko from GAO for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Chairman Gianforte and Palmer, ranking members Plaskett and Raskin, and members of the subcommittees. I'm pleased to be here today to discuss GAO's work evaluating federal agencies' permitting processes for energy infrastructure. While my testimony focuses on energy infrastructure permitting, GAO has done work looking at many other infrastructure projects, and many of the issues around permitting are broadly applicable. It is essential to understand that permitting large infrastructure projects is a complex process involving adherence to federal, state, and local laws and regulations. As such, it is often the case that multiple federal, state agencies, as well as other stakeholders, will be involved. Our work on energy infrastructure permitting has identified 5 broad categories of factors that can affect the timeliness of the permitting process. First, coordination and communication are essential. In particular, having a lead federal agency to coordinate the efforts of other federal, state, and local stakeholders can be beneficial to expedite permitting processes. For example, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission takes a lead role in coordinating environmental reviews with other federal agencies and stakeholders in pipeline permitting. As such, FERC and 9 other agencies have signed interagency agreements for early coordination of environmental and historic preservation reviews in order to encourage timely development of pipeline projects. Both industry representatives and public interest groups have told us that having FERC as a lead agency has made the process for permitting interstate pipelines more efficient than that of intrastate pipelines where FERC is not involved. A second factor involves human capital, or more simply, having the right federal employees with the right skills in the right places to perform environmental reviews and other required actions for permit approval. For example, in 2016, we reported that the Bureau of Indian Affairs' long-standing workforce challenges had contributed to lengthy and unpredictable permit reviews that had hindered Indian energy projects and therefore cost tribes and their members significant time and money in lost or delayed opportunities. We recommended that BIA assess critical skills and competencies needed to effectively perform permit reviews, and BIA has begun developing a workforce plan to address these skill and competency gaps. Federal agencies must also set reasonable timeframes for completing permit reviews and measure their performance using reliable data. Only then can agencies identify and address inefficiencies in their processes. We have often found that while agencies may have guidelines for how long permit reviews should take, they often do not record key dates, such as when a permit application was first received, when it was deemed to be complete, and when the agency began conducting its review. Without such simple measures, we have sometimes found it impossible to know whether or not the agency is meeting its timelines. Another recurring issue in our work has been that agencies report that applications are sometimes incomplete when submitted and cannot be reviewed until applicants provide additional information. Sometimes this appears to be the result of a lack of experience of some applicants, but other times it seems that the requirements for having a complete application may be unclear, or that different agency offices have different standards for completeness or for when to start the review. Lastly, changes to laws, regulations, or policies can cause longer permitting times. For example, after the 2010 Deepwater Horizon oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico, Interior reviewed and revised decades-old safety requirements for offshore drilling. We found that permit review times increased after these new requirements were adopted as applicants and agency officials became familiar with the new process. To help make permitting processes more efficient, we have made numerous recommendations over the years, and agencies have generally been in agreement and taken steps to improve their performance. As always, more can be done. We look forward to taking a broad look at energy permitting processes for your subcommittees in the coming year and looking for additional ways to improve efficiency and performance. This ends my oral remarks. I'll be happy to answer any questions you may have. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. We now recognize Mr. Howard for his statement.
Thank you, Chairman Giafante, Palmer, Ranking Members Plaskett and Raskin, members of the subcommittee. The problem that we're faced with is that the goals of environmental review are undisputably valid. It's very important to look at a project and its effects before sometimes billions of dollars are spent on the project so that the public knows what they're in for. And the regulatory complexity that causes delay is also, to an extent, unavoidable. There are fire code requirements and as well as environmental requirements, but most of these requirements are legitimate. The problem is that there's no mechanism in the government and among the different levels of government to make the value judgments that prioritize these concerns and then make a judgment to move forward. So in an effort to achieve a perfect compliance with often hundreds, sometimes thousands of regulatory requirements, it can take years, sometimes more than a decade. And that's the problem we're confronted with here, which is the absence of decision-making authority to make practical judgments. America is a country of practicality. The environmental and permitting process in this country is a process of dysfunction and paralysis, and the opposite of practicality. In 2015, Common Good, which I chair, released a research paper, 2 years, not 10 years, which tried to, on order of magnitude, evaluate the cost and the harm caused by permitting delays. And while there's no comprehensive data on large projects, it was common that projects would be delayed by years, sometimes more than a decade. We also found that in countries such as Germany and Canada, with which our economy competes, typically projects like this are approved within 1 or 2 years at most. In calculating the harm, we, assuming a 6-year delay in a large project, found that the delay more than doubled the cost of infrastructure. That's wasted money for the American economy. 30% of the increase is in direct cost, inflation and an extra overhead, and the indirect cost of sustained inefficiencies and loss of benefits, being stuck in traffic jams or waiting for as inefficient century-old locks on rivers finally open up, lost electricity in inefficient power lines, more than doubles the cost of the infrastructure. We also found that lengthy environmental review is typically harmful to the environment because it delays, when you have half-century or century-old infrastructure, it delays the improvements to infrastructure that get rid of the traffic jams or the waste of electricity. The cause of delay is not the fact that we do environmental review, is that there are no clear lines of authority to make the needed practical choices. So, for example, environmental review statements on large projects now are typically characterized by a flood of detail that can be characterized as no pebble left unturned. A project in a pipeline in Wyoming, for example, had detail about the possibility of gates being left open when the power line was built so that cows might wander off. It had a point about the trucks used in construction emitted fumes, and therefore that caused pollution. These are completely self-evident points that are not at all important to the decision whether to build this power line. There are big issues and material issues involved with the power line. It shouldn't have thousands of pages of detail like this. In the Bayonne Bridge, a project to raise the roadway of a bridge using its existing foundations to permit more efficient ships into Newark Harbor, the environmental assessment ended up being 10,000 pages plus another 10,000 pages of exhibits and took 5 years, including studies of historic buildings within a 2-mile radius of either end of the bridge, even though the project was not touching any buildings, and traffic studies, even though the project was not changing the flow of traffic over that bridge. That's the kind of detail that ends up adding cost and time to these projects because no one has authority to actually make a choice about what's important in a particular project. It doesn't help public policy and it doesn't help public debate to get it lost in detail. But environmental review is not the only problem. There's also permitting, and for example, in the Bayonne Bridge, 47 permits from 19 different agencies. The effect of all this, in our view, is that the White House cannot solve the problem. Its goals, we think, are all valid. As Ranking Member Plaskett said, many of these goals have been set forth in prior statutes, but what's needed is congressional help in clarifying lines of authority so that the chair of CEQ can decide what's important in a project, someone in the White House can resolve disagreements among different agencies, and so forth. And if Congress would do that, we propose legislative language, I think it would go a long ways toward getting the decrepit infrastructure rebuilt in this country. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Goldfuss.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Chairman Palmer and Gianforte and Ranking Members Raskin and Plaskett for inviting me to participate in this important discussion about Federal permitting process and finding a path forward. Both Republicans and Democrats have sought to improve the process by which we permit major infrastructure projects while also ensuring community input and clean air, clean water, and wildlife are protected. The U.S. Congress has acted to address this issue 3 times in the past 6 years, passing MAP 21 in 2012, WRDA in 2014, and most importantly, the FAST Act in 2015. The 3 laws included bipartisan provisions to clarify several permitting requirements and provide the Federal Government with many new tools to expedite the review process without sacrificing environmental considerations and community input. The Trump administration has not used these tools to maximize permitting efficiencies. Instead of recognizing its own failures and addressing them, the administration has asked Congress to cut corners and gut cornerstone environmental laws. My experience in the U.S. Federal Government, both as Deputy Director of the National Park Service and leading the Council on Environmental Quality, gave me a front-row seat to the interagency difficulties that can slow this permitting process. This confirmed for me that the permitting reforms are necessary, but those calling for gutting the environmental laws were using the reform process as a Trojan horse. Given my experience, I recommend 5 steps for consideration by the committee when reviewing the path forward. First, hold the administration to account for implementing the recent permitting reforms and authorities that Congress enacted. For example, recognizing the need for further study of the cause of project delays, the Congress directed DOT to establish a public-facing online tracking system for projects. This is called the Federal Infrastructure Permitting Dashboard, and it can help to expedite projects and understand the true cause of the delays. The permitting dashboard is still very much a work in progress with incomplete data and limited mapping capabilities, but it really does have significant untapped potential. Next, appoint people with collaborative project implementation and permitting expertise. The Federal Highway Administration, which processes approximately 10% of the Federal Government's environmental impact statements in any given year, still does not have an administrator. Also, key positions in the EOP are left vacant. In 2015, the Federal Permitting Improvement Steering Council, whose core function is to coordinate these agencies, was established with an executive director appointed by the President. The connection to the EOP is integral to the success of the executive director, who needs to build relationships with deputy secretaries and staff across these agencies. Incredibly important position. President Trump still has not appointed anyone to this position. Third, both Congress and the administration should fund environmental review through implementing existing fee authority for cost recovery and the regular appropriations process. The FAST Act gave FIPSI fee authority, and the notice to implement that fee authority was put out this week. That's great news, but still way too slow for an administration that places priority on permitting. Fourth, a lot can be learned from studying and collecting data on environmental review about contracting practices. Congress could work with GAO to make sure that incentives for federal contractors are appropriately structured to achieve efficient and quality environmental analysis and not extraordinarily long documents. Lastly, the permitting review process must be objective and free from political interests and conflicts. The administration's handling of the Hudson Tunnel Project, an infrastructure proposal to modernize bridges and tunnels that ferry commuters from New Jersey to Manhattan, lays bare the current level of political meddling. Since a bipartisan meeting in September, the President has refused to fund the project unless the Senate agrees to fund the southern border wall. The Trump administration points to burdensome environmental reviews as the culprit, yet recently a senior administration official was quoted as saying they are slow-walking the review and the release of that document. In conclusion, there is already evidence that the new administrative tools, when used, can ensure that environmental review of major infrastructure projects is efficient. Instead of rushing into further gutting of statutes that provide for public input on infrastructure and clean air and clean water, we need to make sure that we implement the existing toolkit that the administration already has. Thank you for allowing me to testify, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Mr. Baxt, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Chairman Gianforte and Palmer, ranking members Plaskett and Raskin, and distinguished members of subcommittees, thank you for this opportunity to discuss the federal regulatory obstacles facing infrastructure development. My name is Darren Baxt. I'm a senior research fellow at the Heritage Foundation. The views I express in this testimony are my own and should not be construed as representing any official position of the Heritage Foundation. Protecting the environment and building critical infrastructure are not mutually exclusive goals. Yet federal environmental regulations are creating unnecessary obstacles to effectively and efficiently build critical infrastructure projects. There are 3 federal regulatory obstacles that I'd like to discuss today. First, let's look at the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA. There's a bipartisan recognition that there are problems with the NEPA process. For example, to facilitate projects that were funded by the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, better known as the stimulus package, the Obama administration recognized that NEPA reviews can be expedited to speed up project investment without sacrificing the environment by effectively relinquishing NEPA requirements for projects. Trying to expedite the development of projects by cutting the red tape should not be the exception, but the rule. In the NEPA conference report nearly 50 years ago, legislators made it clear that they did not want undue delay in the processing of federal proposals. Yet a recent National Association of Environmental Professionals report found that the average preparation time of 177 final EISs was 5.1 years in 2016. Second, let's look at the Endangered Species Act. The ESA was created and enacted into law in 1973 to promote the conservation of species. Unfortunately, the law has failed to achieve its mission. For example, only about 3% of species listed have been recovered and delisted as a result. But making matters worse, the law has created obstacles for major infrastructure projects. For example, according to a 2014 New York Times article, quote, already federal officials had delayed, altered, or denied permits for more than 24 energy projects in the West because of the bird, and the bird they're referring to is the sage grouse. There are very important reasons to protect endangered species, but that's not the same thing as protecting the Endangered Species Act. After 45 years, valuable lessons have been learned regarding the law, and specifically whether or not it achieves its purpose. Those lessons need to be applied and not ignored. And then third, let's look at the Clean Water Act. I'd like to highlight two issues with the Clean Water Act, with the implementation of the Clean Water Act. Not the statute itself, but the implementation. And these two issues will also demonstrate some issues common across many environmental statutes. One, there's an agency disrespect for states. The Clean Water Act expressly indicates right at the outset of the statute that the primary role of states in addressing water pollution. Yet the EPA and Corps, even before the 2015 Clean Water Rule, have been trying to have, there's been federal overreach, and they try to regulate waters and intrude on traditional state and local powers. The second issue is unclear and subjective federal regulations. Objectivity and clarity of regulations is certainly important to regulated parties. For a law like the Clean Water Act that has civil and criminal penalties, it's really important. Clear regulations, though, are also very beneficial to those officials enforcing the law. It allows agencies such as the EPA and the Corps to have consistency across districts or regions, and to focus resources on the primary problems, not on waters that may not even be covered under the law. As it connects to permitting, these two issues lead to overbroad definitions of what waters are covered under the Clean Water Act. The EPA and Corps are requiring more permits for more people and for more activities than is consistent with the text and intent of the underlying law. In conclusion, protecting the environment does not have to mean blocking infrastructure projects, trampling on property rights, or ignoring principles of federalism. Thank you. I look forward to your questions.
Okay, thank you to all the witnesses for your testimony today. We'll move now to the period where we ask some questions and have some dialogue and dig a little deeper, and I'll recognize myself for 5 minutes to begin the questioning. I'd like to start with you, Mr. Howard. You made an interesting comment. I'm a business guy. I'm always looking for best practices to adopt, and you made a comment about how other countries like Germany, Canada, and Australia have managed to reduce permit processing times while maintaining environmental quality. Could you explain a little more about what they've done to achieve that?
Yes, quite interesting. So, for example, with Germany, they divide projects into local or regional or national projects. And so with more local projects, the presumptive authority goes to a local body, the state, and it is in charge of doing all that's required, including complying with the federal laws. It can't ignore the federal laws, but it's in charge of making the decisions. And if it acted in a way that was arbitrary, that is to say it ignored the federal laws, it could, someone could go to court. So there are courts in Germany, just as there are here, and say they ignored the law. But in general, they have clear lines of authority. And so if it's it's a big federal project, it's an offshore platform in the North Sea or some other sort of large project, the federal government has presumptive authority. And officials actually can make decisions. This is what we think is important to study when doing the tunnel under the city of Leipzig. And they will focus on the large environmental effects, and they won't talk about whether the construction trucks are emitting fumes. They'll have a 50-page document that talks about what's important so that people can see it.
So, making those observations, what lessons can we learn to apply here?
Very clear. I think that the head of CEQ, which was appointed as part of NEPA, which I believe is quite a good statute and an important statute, should have authority to resolve all issues about scope and adequacy of environmental review, for example.
Do those other countries have the same level of litigation that the United States has?
Not the same level. They do have litigation, but again, the difference is the courts in this country tend to focus on, well, did you leave the pebble unturned? And the process goes on for years, and it has all kinds of negative effects just in the way we write projects. That's why they're thick as they are, because people are trying to avoid litigation. The courts there focus on materiality. They look at the benefits of a project as well as the harms of a project and make a decision.
Okay. Mr. Bakst, while we're on this topic of litigation, What impact does litigation have on permit applicants' efforts to prepare environmental impact studies?
So in 1970, when NEPA was enacted, there were none of these federal environmental statutes. There were no citizen suit provisions that exist now. At the time, Congress didn't envision that plaintiffs would be able to get standing like they do now. And unfortunately, what's happening is even when you have an EIS, a final EIS, there's can be up to 6 years for a lawsuit to be brought. This just extends and delays the project. And quite simply, if you're an investor or somebody who's thinking about being a part of this infrastructure project, this delay may just be a reason not to even go forward in the first place. So we may focus on the delays of the projects that we know about. The problem is, what are the projects that we don't know about that never came to be? And I think a lot of that has to do with the litigation.
Okay. I'd like to follow on that with Mr. Howard. What changes could Congress or the executive branch make that would respect the judicial process while reducing the incidence of frivolous lawsuits?
I think you have to change the standard of review and instruct the courts to try to abide by an expedited schedule. And also shorten the statute of limitations dramatically to probably a matter of 60 or 90 days for most projects, because people know what the issues are by the time the environmental review statement is done. And there should be a materiality standard that makes it clear that the court shouldn't intervene unless someone has really done the review in bad faith or made a conclusion that can't withstand any sort of reasonable standard. And Congress can change that standard.
Okay. Mr. Baxter, would you like to add anything to that?
Yeah, I would just say that I think one of the key issues is that the courts are in a position reviewing things that they shouldn't be reviewing. It shouldn't be a gotcha type of system where if you make one little mistake, then there goes the project. I think there needs to be some type of deference that exists, and certainly for these projects, if there's some type of material problem with an EIS, it's one thing, but if it's just a minor little defect, that shouldn't, mean the end of the project. Courts shouldn't be trying to make those types of decisions. They're not in the position to do so.
Okay, thank you. I'd now like to recognize the ranking member, Ms. Plaskett, for her questions.
Thank you. Ms. Goldfuss, thank you for your insights you are providing here into the federal permitting process. You mentioned that instead of issuing new executive orders, the administration should have its focus on what's already in place, the Federal Permitting Improvement Steering Council, which was created under what we all know as the FAST Act, Fixing American Surface Transportation. As I understand it, the FAST Act and the council it created enabled agencies with jurisdiction over projects to have improved early coordination, clarified roles and responsibilities, establishment of milestones, and better transparency when it comes to environmental reviews. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And that sounds like streamlining and efficiency to me. Can you elaborate on how the council was specifically designed to streamline projects, excuse me, and make environmental reviews or permitting more efficient?
So just as Mr. Howard has been discussing, there is an issue with so many different statutes and decision-making deep within the agencies. So both when I was at the National Park Service and then moving to the White House, I saw how people could have disagreements and there was no one that forced those disagreements to be resolved. And what the Permitting Steering Council allows is all those agencies and their deputy secretaries to sit at the table, see a dashboard of the major projects that they're facing and the timelines that they agreed to. So what it was envisioned to do was look at the sticking points and the issues that needed to be resolved, bring them into the Secretary's office early, and make sure that those difficulties were resolved so that the timeline would be adhered to. What we haven't talked a bunch about is that there are many different factors around funding and design and local requirements and state requirements that also hold up this process. And because we have so little data on when the timeline starts and what agencies are doing, it's very easy to blame the statutes and blame these agencies. And that's why the steering committee allows us to unshape
And who would have that data? where would that ideally be situated?
Ideally, at this point, it would be on the dashboard. And the dashboard that was also created through the FAST Act is a public-facing technological tool that would allow project sponsors and the agencies to see what the timeline is and the progress that's being made.
So can you give an example or two of projects that benefited from the council or in your past experience would have benefited from the council if it was working at the time of that those projects were in place?
Yes, I mean, the highest profile, obviously, the council's only been around for 3 years. We had a transition in the middle and still no executive director. But the highest profile example that we have is the Mid-Barataria Wetlands Sediment Project in Louisiana. This was an enormous project that involved state agencies and U.S. Corps, EPA, and many other agencies across the federal government. And initially, it was thought that it was going to be a 10-year time frame to get through the permitting project. But through working with the council, working with the state, and then having funds from the BP oil spill settlement, they've been able to get to an agreed-upon timeline that is actually 2 years. And it will be on the dashboard so everybody can see the progress being made on that timeline.
Okay. You discussed we were just talking about the 2 executive orders that the President has made. Executive Order 13766, which was intended to identify, quote, high-priority infrastructure projects, and the other was Executive Order 13807, which created a, quote, one federal decision mechanism to supposedly expedite major infrastructure projects. So as you discussed, the Federal Permitting Improvement Steering Council already in place, were these executive orders necessary?
The first executive order that you referenced, which would identify high-priority projects, was within the first week of the administration, and it almost seemed as if they didn't know the Federal Permitting Council existed. The second one came along, put the one decision-maker policy in place, and corrected some of the high-priority issues that were in the first executive order. So although there has been a large priority on permitting and press releases, I would say, and executive orders, there's very little attention on the authority that the White House and these agencies already have to speed up the process.
And you discussed needing an executive director. How would that facilitate the council being able to operate?
This is a person that would have a connection to the EOP, connection to the president, and ideally a relationship with the project sponsors. So the executive director is that person that can unstick the problems and really make sure that we move these projects along. That is a key position that needs to be filled.
Okay, quickly, and Mr. Rusko, in your testimony, you cite different factors, and we've heard that there are other factors that are involved. You also note that the FAST Act includes provisions for streamlining the infrastructure permitting process and codified into law a permitting dashboard to track project timelines. Core coordination communication among agencies has been a problem. What do you think the solutions to that are?
Well, I think, we have found that there have been some examples of attempts to improve coordination and communication. So one is obviously FERC, being a lead agency, has helped in permitting pipelines. Another example is Indian Energy Service Center, which has been proposed to be a one-stop shop for information about permitting for energy projects on tribal and Indian lands. Now, they have not set it up effectively to be a coordinating body, but they have the intent to do so. And if they do that and they get all of the resource agencies that are going to be involved, they will be able to improve the access for applicants to information they need to pursue applications, and they'll also be able to help agency offices process those applications.
Thank you. I yield back.
Okay. This time I'll recognize Mr. Comer for his questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate this committee hearing because this is one of the biggest complaints that I get as I travel my district. A couple of projects I wanted to mention and then ask some questions. First, in my district in Kentucky, southern Kentucky, we have 8 lakes with marinas. Every lake, and that's from 6 hours from east to west in my southern Kentucky congressional district. Each lake is at maximum capacity with their current boat slips. We've had permits, they've had permits, several of the lakes, to build new marinas, to even expand the number of slips they have to increase their capacity. This has to go through the Army Corps of Engineers. The permitting process is a nightmare. We recently announced a new marina opening on Lake Cumberland in eastern Kentucky. It took 12 years for that to get approved. Is there anything that can be done with respect to the Corps of Engineers permitting for infrastructure projects? Can anyone answer that question?
I grew up in Whitesburg, Kentucky, and then moved to Mount Sterling. So I'm one of your.
Yeah. I know where Mount Sterling is.
Yeah, historically a constituent. So I know many of the lakes in question. Ultimately, the choices should be politically accountable, including, in my view, choices by the Corps of Engineers. There are laws that they have to comply with that Congress passed, but there needs to be, and there's a rule of reason typically that applies to things like docks and permitting. And if there's too much delay, there ought to be political accountability to the people in the Corps. And what's happened with all the bureaucracy that's grown up, really just over the last 50 years, is that there's no link between the White House and, or virtually no link in the Corps of Engineers. And one of the reasons to restore clear lines of authority is to actually reconnect those, not to let the White House make the decision about docks and lakes, but if some agency is dragging its feet, to make a decision and then call the question and get it resolved.
Okay. Another very important project that I'm working with Congressman Bucshon on is a new bridge, Interstate 69 between Evansville, Indiana and Henderson, Kentucky. We've been waiting for a long time on the environmental impact study, and I appreciate the question the Chairman asked about litigation and things like that. This project is number one priority for both Congressman Bucshon and myself. A very important link between an interstate that goes through Tennessee and basically from Canada to Mexico. Really will open up a rural part of America. And the permit process, you know, every time that we check with the government agencies, they'll blame another agency. They'll say it's delayed. What can Congress do to try to streamline the process? Because if you meet with one of the bureaucrats, they will always say, well, we're doing better than we've ever done. We're, pat themselves on the back, but it still is delayed, and it's a frustration that's holding America back. Not just my district. I don't think my district's unique to anything. What legislatively, or are there any legislative solutions, or is this all an executive branch function to try to streamline the process to get the permitting process? If we have an infrastructure bill next year, a major infrastructure bill like the President wants, I'm concerned that this won't go anywhere near the timeline that Congress hopes. So I guess I'll let anyone answer any questions on advice on how we as Congress or as representatives can encourage the administration to try to streamline the process.
You know, the bureaucrats probably are doing a good job. The problem is there are 12 different agencies that have jurisdiction. And so if there's not a motivated political figure at a very high level forcing it to happen, as happened, I think, in Louisiana, as happened with the Gateway Tunnel process that got expedited, it's happened with the Tappan Zee Bridge in New York. If you don't have that front page political willpower to make that bridge happen, it will get bogged down for, it could be decades. And again, I think there is a legislative solution. You need to reconnect the lines in the hierarchy. We'd be happy to work with your office and talk about what the really quite simple legislative reconnections are that don't involve changing the underlying substantive law.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. At this time, I will recognize Mr. Duncan for his questions.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. First of all, when I chaired the Aviation Subcommittee in another committee several years ago, we had a hearing one time with the head of the Atlanta airport and other witnesses. And he told or testified that the newest runway at the Atlanta airport took 14 years from conception to completion. It took they were so happy to get all the final approvals, and all the problems were environmental rules and regulations. They built the runway in 33 days. They were so excited they worked around the clock. So I guess you could say 99 work days. Then when I chaired the Highways and Transit Subcommittee, there were two different federal highway studies which said that the average highway project took, one study said 13 years from conception to completion, one said 15 years. This puts us at a disadvantage globally because most developed countries and even many developing countries are doing these major infrastructure projects in about a third of the time that we are, and at about a third or less of the cost. In addition, it hurts, it's unfair to our taxpayers, and it hurts our economy. I want to mention, though, another thing. These things kind of are all tied in together because I really appreciate the work, Mr. Howard, that you've done through the years on legal reform, and you've been complimented by people on both sides of the political spectrum, and I understand now you're working with former Senator Bradley and Governor Kane in your Common Good organization. But you've written a book called Too Many Lawyers, and you're a lawyer yourself. I was a lawyer and a judge before I came to Congress. But this ties in together because I can tell you, I've read that over the last 50 years, we've sent 50 or 60,000 factories to other countries, and it's mostly because of environmental overregulation and rules and red tape. And when I graduated, got my undergraduate degree, almost any young person with just a bachelor's degree could get a really good job because we didn't just lose factory worker jobs when we sent all those factories away. We lost many white-collar jobs, and so half the young people in the country started going to law school. And as you've noted in your book with too many lawyers, it's the number of lawyers has doubled in this country over the last 30 years or so. And I want to read something from my last newsletter. One of my last newsletters. There are so many rules, regulations, and laws on the books today that no human being could even come close to knowing about or understanding all of them. Harvey Silverglade, a Boston lawyer educated at Princeton and Harvard, has written a new book. On the cover is the following, quote, "The average professional in this country wakes up in the morning, goes to work, comes home, eats dinner, and then goes to sleep unaware that he or she has likely committed several federal crimes that day. Why? The answer lies in the very nature of modern federal criminal laws, which have exploded in number, but also have become impossibly broad and vague," unquote. The Code of Federal Regulations is now 178,277 pages long, the Federal Register 81,402 pages, and the U.S. Tax Code is 73,954 pages. This does not even count all the state and local laws. An innocent mistake is not supposed to be criminal, but a zealous publicity-seeking prosecutor can make even the most innocent mistake look criminal. And there's a retired law professor from Louisiana State University, John Baker, who told the Wall Street Journal recently that said there is no one in the United States over the age of 18 who cannot be indicted for some federal crime. That is not an exaggeration. What I'm getting at, we've got way too many laws, rules, and regulations on the books in this country. We have made some improvements in the last few years in this permitting process, but we still go ridiculously overboard, and it takes far too long. The environmental impact statements now take, I think it says in our briefing material, 4.6 years, just that part of it. What do you have to say about all that, Mr. Howard?
Most of the detail in modern regulation is not setting goals like clean air and clean water. It's telling people exactly how to meet those goals. And so we've got this, you might call it a theory of correctness, where you're not actually free. You're free to go and comply with thousands of pages of rules that you can't know. But in my view, the judgment, the problem here is not mainly in the goals, certainly not in having clean air and clean water. It's in the micromanagement. Environmental impact statements were supposed to be, according to the CEQ regs, no more in the most complex project than 300 pages long, the most complex project. You'll find them that are 10,000 pages or 20,000 pages. That's all unnecessary detail. Most regulation, in my judgment, is unnecessarily detail telling people how to make a safe workplace, how to do everything, rather than saying we're going to hold you accountable for a safe workplace or for a reasonable environmental stewardship. So I think the solution lies in restoring human responsibility in place of these dense, mindless, bureaucratic structures that have built up in the last 50 years.
All right, thank you very much.
At this time, I'd like to recognize the ranking member, Mr. Raskin, for his comment, for his questions.
Mr. Chair, thank you very much for your flexibility. Ms. Goldfuss, let me ask you, the CRS has said that environmental review is typically not the greatest source of delay in surface transportation projects, and went on to say, quote, developing a community consensus on what to do, securing the funding, and dealing with affected residents and businesses, including utilities and railroads, also contribute to the long timelines required to complete certain projects. Do you agree with that general assessment?
Completely agree.
A recent memo written by CRS in response to questions about Mr. Howard's 2 years, not 10 years report found that in the reports he cited, quote, a common, if not the primary issue identified in each report relates to funding. And then again, quote, no outside report or study cited in the Howard report identified permitting generally or compliance with specific local, state, or federal requirements in particular as a primary barrier to completing various infrastructure projects. Now, from 2015 to 2017, you were managing director of the White House Council on Environmental Quality, is that right?
Correct.
And in that time, you oversaw, as part of setting up the Federal Permitting Improvement Steering Council, the creation of an online federal infrastructure permitting dashboard to track the progress of different infrastructure projects, is that right?
Yes, we worked with National Economic Council and OMB to set that up, and all the agencies that participate.
Okay, so based on that experience and the data received on the dashboard, would you agree that project delays are primarily caused by some factor other than the permitting process?
The point of the dashboard is to collect that information. GAO's report from 2014 showed that we have very little data. That data is just coming about. And so anecdotally, we know that we can point to, all right, this project has its EIS, here's the time frame, we met it or we missed it. So the dashboard is designed to show us what the real delay is. The reality is you can have your environmental impact statement. If you don't have funding to build the bridge doesn't get built.
Gotcha. Okay. I want to go to the question of how agency budgeting cuts affect the permitting process. In its 2015 Red Book, the Federal Highway Administration said that limited budgets and staff resources preclude agencies from assigning staff to work on reviews when staff may already be strained to process pending workload in a timely manner. Do you agree with that assessment?
Completely agree. We now have NEPA officials that are wearing multiple hats, and this is just a small part of their job. If they're overseeing large contracts for environmental impact statements or other environmental reviews, it's very difficult for them to keep on top of it.
Okay. I read an article that you wrote with Allison Cassidy, in which you said the best way for the Trump administration to speed up permitting without sacrificing environmental protection is to adequately fund the relevant federal agencies involved in the permitting and environmental review process. Without funding, the federal agencies cannot hire and train staff to complete environmental reviews or invest in technology that provides efficiencies. Do you want to elaborate on that point?
My point there, and I do think, again, it's something similar to what Mr. Howard said. I mean, you'd be shocked at the antiquated tools that some of these agencies have with doing the review and the small number of human capital, the small number of people we have actually doing the reviews. These are highly important projects. Industry would demand, corporations would demand using the best digital tools, the best information sharing so that we wouldn't have redundancies, so agencies could coordinate early on to make sure that we're expediting this process. Instead, we have limited talent, people who are doing multiple jobs, and as a result, potentially even misaligned incentives with our environmental review contracting process that pays for more pages rather than quality and efficiency.
The President has proposed a cut of $2.8 billion in the EPA, and I assume, based on what you just said, that what this would mean would be further delays and further postponement of the process. Why would we be actually defunding the agencies that could make the permitting process work?
This is a fact of governing. I mean, the agencies have to be funded, the ones that have the talent, and EPA has the most talent and tools to share with the other agencies. They're also responsible for tracking and signing off on EISs. So if you're cutting the workforce that needs to do the work, it does not make sense that you're going to speed up the timeframes. So the rhetoric doesn't match the governing that's happening in the administration right now. They need to fund EPA, they need to fully implement the fee authority they have through the Federal Permitting Council to put the money towards new tools and really use the dashboard and make sure that we take advantage of all that we can in modern tools of data sharing and data collection.
Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, thank you. And this time I'd like to recognize Mr. Palmer for his questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This question is for Mr. Howard and Mr. Bask. Do we need all of the various agencies and sub-agencies and that linear structure of people out there that have to give approval to get a project done? Or can we do this in a more expedited manner with fewer people?
I believe in the one lead agency idea, so I think decision-making should be clarified, which isn't to say that you leave them out completely, but you don't necessarily give everybody an equal voice. I would second what Ms. Gelfo says about funding, particularly for CEQ. I would give CEQ more authority and 3 times as much money and put the spotlight on them and say, if this is not moving forward, it's your fault. I mean, just put, that's, you know, that's the agency that's supposed to be in charge of environmental review. And I wouldn't give undue power to the Corps of Engineers.
Are you suggesting we should hold anybody in federal government accountable for something?
Yeah, I know, that's a radical idea.
Well, I think we're at a point now, Mr. Chairman, where we need to consider some radical ideas. Mr. Bask, would you like to respond to that?
I would just say that I think I'm going to agree with the one agency idea, but I think there is kind of an underlying assumption with a lot of these projects that it's almost like a precautionary principle type of concept, that these projects are not going to go forward unless you can pretty much prove in extreme detail that there's not going to be any environmental problem whatsoever. And the reality is there's many benefits to these projects, including meeting very critical infrastructure needs, such as water and transportation. And we tend to forget that. And I think it's, regardless of how many people are working at the agencies doing NEPA, or how much money is spent, if you have a lot of people doing a lot of inefficient and duplicative work, then you're just wasting their time and more money. The reality is that's the cart before the horse. What we need to do is have a more efficient process in the first place. We need to have specific deadlines for projects. When developing these projects, you shouldn't have to look at every possible alternative that you have and examine that you're going to identify the alternative that definitely is going to have the least impact on the environment. The idea would be to identify those alternatives that are actually feasible, not
let me suggest something here, and I think it's easy to disparage federal regulators and people who are trying to do their job. I don't think that's how you solve the problem. I think having worked for a couple of international engineering construction companies, I have a pretty good idea of how you get things done. I go back to Mr. Howard, I think you have to assign accountability, but there's also a quality of life issue here when it comes to infrastructure that impacts both the environment, public safety, and public health. When you have particularly cities in the South that are subject in the summertime to higher ozone levels, the more traffic congestion you have, the worse those levels become. Consequently, when you tie up projects that could reduce that amount of congestion, and you have far more pollution produced by cars sitting on the highway than driving on the highway, that becomes a balancing act that the people in charge of the permitting have to take into account. And then you have to take into account the economic benefits of it that get delayed because of this. And the city of Birmingham is a prime example of this by not completing that Northern Belt Line. So I think that's all part of the issue here. The other thing that I want to ask about is, and the ranking member, Ms. Plaskett, has lived through this, as have other members of Congress from natural disasters, and how we expedite the permitting process to rebuild infrastructure. And some of the very frustrating things we've gone through, like the Stafford Act and having to build things back. I think that we can learn some lessons from how we recover from natural disasters for improving our overall infrastructure, because I think everybody in this room knows that we're in a real critical point in this country in regard to first of all, rebuilding our infrastructure and getting it up to speed, whether it's highways or, as we've seen in other parts of the country, our waterworks. And the longer we take to get this done, the worse it's going to get, and the more it's going to cost, and the more negative benefits it's going to have on public well-being. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Okay, thank you. I want to follow on with one additional question for you, Mr. Rusko. The GAO has shown that many agencies are not tracking permitting milestones, like the date a permit was submitted or the final date of approval, and therefore have no data to determine if they're achieving expected results. Could you shine a little more light on that, what you found as you have done this research?
Sure. For example, I'll just take applications for permits to drill for onshore BLM. You go to different field offices. You get different approaches to documenting when applications come in, when they're complete, and when they start the review process. So that you're going to get what you measure, and you can't go to a central database in BLM, although the databases exist, and track permitting times. And you should be able to, because sometimes, sometimes they get an application, it's not complete. Well, they have to send it back. That's not their fault. That shouldn't count against them in the time. Sometimes they get an application, they get it all the way to the end, and then the company just abandons it. All that needs to be known. But there are other times when they're understaffed and they don't get to it, and they're missing their time frames. And we need to know what the difference is so that they can fix the ones they can fix. If they need more staff, they have to have the data to say, we're missing these deadlines because we don't have the staff to do the permit reviews.
So adoption of some standard practices and tracking methodologies would help us at least instrument the permitting process and have a basis then to improve.
Absolutely, and better IT tools.
Okay. In your written testimony, you identified incomplete applications as a contributing factor to delays. Could you talk a little bit about that in more detail?
Yeah, so where we found that typically, and again, I'll refer to oil and gas development. So as you know, the oil and gas business is kind of boom and bust. And when it's booming, all kinds of folks are coming in and they're filing applications for rights of ways and permits to drill, and they don't necessarily understand the process. So there's an opportunity for better better communication and explanation about what the process is. That's something the agency could do. But sometimes it is just a learning curve for applicants. And the same thing happens when you have a change in regulations, as happened in the Gulf after the BP disaster, that they strengthened some safety requirements. It took people a while to figure out how to do those, and then the permitting times settled down.
In your research, have you found agencies that do a good job of educating applicants on how to navigate the process?
Well, I've sort of repeatedly brought up FERC. That in some cases, so for example, for permitting an LNG facility, you have an option of doing a pre-application process, and in that pre-application process, you basically get a primer on here's all the boxes you're going to have to tick, here's all the agencies you're going to have to deal with, and that, according to a lot of the folks we've talked to, helps them understand, okay, we know what we have to do, and we know the time frames. And by and large, the permitting process for LNG's facilities has not been as slow as some things that you've seen. There was a large delay while DOE made a determination. They basically stopped the process, and DOE made a determination that LNG exports was in the national interest. But in terms of the FERC process and all, coordinating with Coast Guard and coordinating with resource agencies where necessary, that process went fairly smoothly.
So you believe there's a role for the agency in helping applicants navigate the permitting process instead of it being a black box where you don't know what you're going to get back?
It's very important for there to be transparency in what is required and also the timing. When can you go to the next step? And there should be a place where you can go and track your progress online and see where it is. And that often doesn't exist.
Okay. I'd like to recognize Mr. Palmer for a follow-on question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I had written myself a note and overlooked it, and I apologize. I just want to know how much input do the state and local governments have in the permitting process and getting to a final approval? Mr. Howard.
Yeah, it depends on the project. A power line from the wind farm in Wyoming to the Pacific Northwest had to get the approval of every county in Idaho over which the line passed, which I find to be absurd. It's an interstate line. They shouldn't have to go to 100 hearings in Idaho for to get the approval. So it depends on the project. As I suggested earlier, it shouldn't be a gauntlet. People should honor the legitimate regulatory goals at each level of government, but it shouldn't be a gauntlet. If it's an interstate project, I think the feds ought to be in charge. If it's local, I think the local ought to be in charge.
All right. The reason I bring that up is we had a hearing with some county engineers, one of whom was from Alabama, and they had a culvert washed out of a county road, and that is a no-brainer. I mean, just replacing the culvert, putting the road back, right, is the only. It gave access to residents to the property. I want to say it took almost a year to get that put in. That should have been weeks, not months. Right. And that should have been a local deal. Now, there was federal intervention in that on permitting. It involved water. But, there needs to be a level at which, and I think it's been suggested in MAP 21 that there could be a level of cost under $2 million or under $5 million, I don't remember exactly which one it was, that it's an expedited permitting process where you leave that to the county or to the municipality.
Mr. Rusko made a good point. The OECD countries in Europe now have established some one-stop shops for everyone. So there were offices where the government is supposed to help you get the permit. If a culvert washes out and you need to get the road fixed, there ought to be some place you can go that will coordinate all of that and raise holy hell if somebody's holding it up for a year. And instead, you're going to literally 11 different agencies to try to get a permission.
I thank the Chairman for his indulgence. I yield back.
Okay. Chair now recognizes Mr. Grothman for his questions.
Thank you. First for Mr. Bax, do you feel the federal environment or the federal environmental review and permitting system currently functions as Congress intended when it originally passed the legislation?
No. When President Nixon signed NEPA into law on the first day of 1970, there was no other federal environmental statutes. We don't have the Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, et cetera. There was no citizen suit provisions. The idea was to take into account environmental considerations, which is very reasonable. Unfortunately, what's happened over time is that through the agencies and through the courts, NEPA has evolved into something that Congress never envisioned when they passed it in 1970, or they passed it in 1969, signed into law in 1970. I think if NEPA didn't exist now, and we looked at the existing federal statutes that are on the books and the way citizen suit provisions exist now, and we wanted to create a procedural statute like NEPA is, we'd be trying to figure out ways to expedite the permitting process, to help people to navigate through all these different federal environmental laws and state and local laws. Unfortunately, NEPA has become a law that existed before these other statutes that's created kind of it's made things more difficult. And I think the reality is we need to make it simpler, not more difficult.
Okay, in general, the amount of things one requires permits for, the time it takes to get permitting done for whatever. I don't know how long all of you have been involved in this game, but you give us a general opinion of where the world stands today or the country stands today compared to, say, 25 years ago. It seems to me things only always get worse. And I'm old enough to remember the 1970s, and I thought the world was pretty idyllic then. Could you comment on that? Have you ever, in all your experience, seen things ever go the other way? Or do we always march steadily for more requirements, more paperwork, more time?
Unfortunately, so one of the points I made in my written testimony was, I think looking at the permitting process and how to be more efficient in dealing with the permits that exist, in some ways is an after-the-fact type of solution. When in reality, we need to look at the before-the-fact issue, which is looking at why permits require.
Can you give us any examples, any of the four of you, in which you can say over the entire time you've been following this, that, yeah, we've improved things since 20 years ago, and it's less paperwork and less time? Can you think of any examples of that? Where you can really say, man, this used to be burdensome, but now we've sort of straightened this out.
Yeah, there are a few things that have happened. People on a local level, Mayor Bloomberg put in a 311 process. It's like a one-stop shop. You call in, you've got a municipal complaint.
Yeah, on a federal level.
Yeah, on the federal level, not too many. I worked with Clinton and Gore in the Reinventing Government program. They dramatically simplified the way officials could buy small items. You know, like you go get a credit card instead of going through a procurement process. So in some ways, it got simplified.
Well, that's kind of a federal thing. How about the way you deal with not the federal government? How about how you deal with industry or business? Can you think of any examples in which it's now?
No, the regulations have only gotten thicker, and the solution, in my view, is not to reform it, but to replace it. And that's the lesson of history. The Uniform Commercial Code replaced 50 complicated commercial codes, and it was great for the country. And in most of these areas, including this one, permitting, in my view, we need to replace it with a simpler program that doesn't change the goals.
So there is no example right now, no good examples where any of the four of you can say, man, we're turning things around quicker than we used to, less paperwork, less cost, it seems in the area.
Say that you know, the reality is if you look at the federal environmental statutes, the agencies are only expanding their power, and they're taking very broad interpretations of statutes and not really meeting the will and intent of the statutes, and they're continuing to expand their power, not limit their power, which means more regulations and more permitting requirements.
So I can say from my time in the last administration that tools like dashboards, tools like scorecards have done a lot to provide transparency into what the agencies are doing, and people do move faster when they're held to account. So from a very macro level, I can't say whether or not it's worse than 20 years ago, but I saw change in a very short period of time.
I guess I'm out of time.
I want to thank the witnesses for appearing before us today. The hearing record will remain open for 2 weeks for any member to submit a written opening statement or questions for the record. If there's no further business, without objection, the subcommittee stands adjourned.